The first time we rang the doorbell, the man opened it empty-handed. When we rang it again, he stepped outside with a pistol. My friend was still crouched beside the house, smiling toward us, because he thought we had recorded the perfect prank. From where he was hiding, he couldn't see the man coming down the porch steps behind him. I was 14 when this happened. At the time, 2 friends and I had started playing ding-dong ditch around our neighborhood. We would pick a random house, ring the bell, and run before anyone answered. It was immature, but we genuinely believed it was harmless. The worst reaction we had received was someone shouting into the street. Most homeowners simply opened the door, looked around for a few seconds, and went back inside. After several successful attempts, we stopped considering what might happen if we chose the wrong house. There were 3 of us that evening. One friend would ring the bell. I would record from a distance, while the third watched the street in case a neighbor or passing driver noticed us. We walked around until we found an ordinary-looking house on a quiet road. There were no obvious cameras near the entrance. One side of the building had no windows, and a row of bushes across the front gave 2 of us somewhere to hide. It seemed ideal. My friend crossed the lawn, climbed the porch steps, and pressed the doorbell. Then he jumped down and ran around the side of the house. The rest of us crouched behind the bushes, trying not to laugh loudly enough to give ourselves away. A few seconds later, the front door opened. A man stepped onto the porch. He didn't appear angry. Mostly, he looked confused. He checked the walkway, glanced toward the street, and leaned slightly over the railing as though someone might be hiding beneath the porch. He never saw us. After several seconds, he returned inside and closed the door. The prank had worked exactly as expected. That should have been enough, but my friend had already decided that he wanted to ring the same doorbell twice. At 14, we thought a second reaction would make the recording funnier. We never stopped to consider what the first ring might have meant to the person inside. My friend waited beside the house until the front door had been closed for less than a minute. Then he ran back toward the porch. He pressed the bell again and returned to the same hiding place. This time, the homeowner didn't answer immediately. 10 seconds passed, then 20. I assumed he had decided to ignore us. My friend crouched beside the house and looked toward the bushes. He was grinning, clearly pleased with himself. Then the door opened. The homeowner stepped outside with a pistol hanging beside his leg. For a moment, I didn't process what I was seeing. He wasn't shouting or waving the weapon around. He walked onto the porch slowly, scanning the yard as though he had already decided someone was hiding nearby. That calmness frightened me more than anger would have. My friend couldn't see the porch from where he was crouching. He was still smiling at us. My other friend and I began waving our hands, trying to warn him without exposing our own position. He misunderstood. He smiled wider, apparently thinking we were celebrating the video. Behind him, the homeowner stepped down from the porch. That was when I realized the man wasn't simply checking the doorway again. He was searching the property. We waved more urgently. My friend finally noticed the panic on our faces. He turned. The smile vanished. He saw the homeowner first. Then his eyes dropped to the pistol. He pushed himself away from the wall and ran. The homeowner turned toward him immediately. My friend sprinted across the lawn, screaming as he headed for the street. I remember watching the gun rather than the person holding it. I expected the man to raise his arm. I waited for the shot. My other friend grabbed my sleeve, and we ran from behind the bushes in the opposite direction. We cut between 2 nearby houses and kept going until the original street disappeared behind us. For a short time, we lost sight of the friend who had rung the bell. I had no idea whether the homeowner had followed him around the property or whether he had made it to the road, because we had scattered in different directions. None of us knew if the others were safe. We eventually met several streets away. All 3 of us were there. No one had been caught, and no shots had been fired. The homeowner had stopped near the edge of his property before returning inside. The final few seconds of the recording showed him walking toward the door with the pistol still in his hand. We never contacted the police. At 14, we were more frightened of being punished than interested in reporting what had happened. We knew we had deliberately gone onto the property and disturbed the homeowner twice. Still, coming outside armed over a doorbell prank was not a reaction any of us expected. We didn't tell our parents. We simply stayed away. None of us returned to that street, and we never played ding-dong ditch again. For years, I told myself the man had only wanted to scare whoever was outside. I don't know whether the gun was loaded, and I'll never know if he intended to use it. What I remember is the delay after the second ring. The first time, he opened the door almost immediately. The second time, he made us wait. I sometimes wonder whether those extra seconds were the time it took him to go into another room, collect the pistol, and come back prepared. My father once delivered a sealed trailer to a military facility in Nevada. When he arrived, nobody opened it. They had already dug a hole large enough to bury the entire vehicle. I was 16 when he told me the story. My father had been a truck driver for most of my teenage years, and I occasionally rode with him on long-distance trips. One night, we were traveling through Northern California. I had been asleep in the back of the cab and woke to find the road completely dark outside. I climbed into the passenger seat. For several minutes, my father drove without saying much. Then he mentioned a delivery he had made years earlier while working for another transport company. He began explaining it, stopped and stared through the windshield. I could tell he was deciding whether he should continue. Eventually, he did. He said the assignment had taken him to a rural farm in southern Iowa. That alone was not especially unusual. Truck drivers collect freight from farms, factories, and private industrial properties all the time. What waited for him there was harder to explain. 6 men stood beside the trailer. According to my father, they were all dressed in dark suits. 2 black SUVs were parked nearby, neither carrying company logos or markings he recognized. The men gave him a destination, but offered no description of the cargo. He was to transport the trailer to a military installation in Nevada. The trailer had to remain sealed. He was expected to stay on the assigned route and stop only for fuel or a bathroom. 1 SUV would lead the convoy. The second would follow behind the truck. Before leaving, one of the men told my father he could travel at whatever speed he considered necessary. That bothered him. Commercial drivers worked under strict rules governing speed, weight, rest periods, and travel time. Telling him that speed was entirely his decision didn't feel like ordinary permission. It sounded as though arriving mattered more than anything that might happen along the way. My father connected the trailer and followed the first SUV away from the farm. The other vehicle remained behind him. For the first part of the journey, everything was quiet. The escorts never contacted him to discuss the cargo. They didn't stop for meals, and my father received no further instructions. As the miles passed, he began noticing what was missing. There had been less paperwork than he expected. No one had provided a clear description of the load or its weight. The men behaved more like armed security than employees of a transport company. He continued anyway. The simplest explanation was that he was carrying sensitive military equipment, and secrecy was part of the job. That explanation lasted until they reached a way station. The station signaled his truck to pull in. The lead SUV continued along the highway. My father had only a few seconds to choose between following the escort or obeying the way station instruction. He stayed with the convoy. A short time later, 2 sheriff's vehicles pulled onto the road with their emergency lights flashing. My father watched them gaining on the truck through his mirrors. He assumed the delivery was over. Ignoring a way station in a commercial vehicle could lead to serious consequences, regardless of who had arranged the shipment. Before the sheriff's cars reached the trailer, the SUV behind him changed lanes. It moved between the police and the truck. Then it began slowing down. My father continued west. From his mirrors, he could see that the officers were now being forced to deal with the escort vehicle instead of reaching him. The SUV ahead maintained its speed. Nobody radioed the truck or instructed him to stop. The convoy simply kept moving. Up to that point, my father could still explain the sealed trailer and the strange escorts as part of a classified military shipment. Watching one of those escorts block 2 sheriff's cars destroyed that explanation. Whatever was behind him had become more important than an ordinary traffic stop, and he was still attached to it. He didn't know whether the officers would eventually catch up. He also had no idea what authority the men possessed or what they would do if he abandoned the route. So he kept driving. The roads became more isolated as they traveled west. Eventually, the lead SUV guided him toward a secured military facility in Nevada. When my father described the location, I interrupted and asked whether he meant Area 51. He said yes. I laughed and told him I didn't believe him. Normally, he would have laughed too, or tried harder to persuade me. Instead, he kept looking at the road. That was when I noticed his hands trembling against the steering wheel. His voice had changed as well. He wasn't telling the story like a trucker sharing an impressive tale. He sounded uncomfortable that he had mentioned it at all. When they arrived at the facility, my father expected a warehouse or unloading area. Instead, he saw a large hole in the ground. It was deep and wide enough to hold the trailer. The men ordered him out of the cab. Another vehicle was already waiting to take him away. He would not be staying while the cargo was handled, and he would not be driving the truck back. Before he entered the waiting vehicle, one of the men warned him not to discuss the delivery. My father climbed inside. As the vehicle pulled away, he looked behind him. The men weren't opening the trailer or transferring the contents. They were lowering the entire trailer into the hole. At that point, the destination stopped being the strangest part of the story. The hole had been prepared before he arrived. Whoever arranged the delivery had always intended to bury the truck with everything still sealed inside. My father was driven to Las Vegas and dropped at the airport. That was where his involvement ended. At least, that was what he told me. I have no documents proving the trip happened. I never learned the name of the company that organized it, and my father refused to guess what the trailer contained. For years, I assumed he had exaggerated at least part of the account. Truck drivers spend long periods alone on the road. Stories change over time, especially when they are retold. But he never told this one again. After finishing, he became quiet and drove through the darkness without looking toward me. I didn't ask any more questions. He never mentioned the delivery after that night. I still don't know what was inside the trailer. The part I returned to is the hole. It wasn't dug after the shipment arrived. It was already waiting. The first scream came from deep inside the forest. The next one sounded closer. By morning, my younger brother was running toward our car, crying and shouting that he had found a dead woman. She was lying a short distance from where we had spent the night. I was around 11 when this happened. My father enjoyed taking us camping during the summer, and occasionally during colder months when the weather allowed it. Several of my brothers usually came with us. On this trip, one of the older ones stayed home, leaving my father, 3 of my brothers, and me. We drove to a forested camping area that felt completely isolated. I don't remember the exact location now. What remains clear is the absence of anything nearby. There were no visible buildings, streetlights, or other campsites around us. By the time we finished setting up the tents, the sun was disappearing behind the trees. My father built a fire, and we dragged several fallen logs around it. For the first few hours, the trip felt ordinary. We ate, talked, and watched the darkness gradually close around the campsite. Once night settled in, one of my brothers began telling scary stories. They were childish stories about ghosts, killers, and things following people through the woods. They would probably sound ridiculous to me now. At 11, sitting beside a dying fire with nothing but trees beyond the light, they worked. Every snapping branch sounded close. Each gap between the trunks looked like it could hide someone standing completely still. Eventually, my father went to sleep. My youngest brother also became tired and climbed into one of the tents. That left 3 of us beside the fire. One of my brothers began another story. He had only been talking for a few minutes when we heard something moving through the bushes. At first, the sound was light. Leaves shifted, and thin branches scraped together. We assumed it was a small animal. Then the movement became heavier. Something was pushing through the undergrowth just beyond the edge of the campsite. My brother stopped speaking. All 3 of us stared toward the same patch of darkness. The fire had burned low, and the bushes were barely visible. One of my brothers said it was probably a deer. The other picked up a flashlight and decided to check. I remember admiring him for walking away from the fire. Looking back, I think he was just as frightened as the rest of us and didn't want to show it. As he approached the bushes, the rustling intensified. Something appeared to be moving directly behind the leaves. My brother stopped a few feet away. The branches continued shaking. Then the sound ended. Not gradually. One moment, something was moving. The next, the forest was silent. My brother waited before reaching forward and pulling the branches apart. Nothing was there. He swept the flashlight across the ground and through the trees. The beam revealed fallen leaves, trunks, and empty darkness. For several seconds, none of us spoke. Then a woman screamed somewhere beyond the campsite. The sound stopped all 3 of us. It didn't resemble an animal to me. It rose sharply, held for a moment, and ended without warning. My brother released the branches and ran back toward the fire. No one made fun of him. We stared into the trees and listened. One of my brothers said that foxes and mountain lions could sound almost human. I wanted to accept that explanation. Then the woman screamed again. This time, the sound came from closer to the campsite. The brother holding the flashlight immediately entered his tent. Another remained beside me for a few seconds longer, staring toward the trees. He asked who would be that far inside the forest at night. Before I could answer, a heavy thud came from beyond the firelight. It sounded like something large striking the ground. My brother ran. I followed him into the tent because I refused to remain outside by myself. We closed the entrance and sat in the dark. None of us woke our father immediately. As an adult, that decision is difficult to understand. At the time, we expected him to say that the scary stories had affected us and that the scream belonged to an animal. More than anything, we wanted him to be right without having to test the explanation. The forest became quiet. That silence was worse than the screaming. Every minor sound seemed connected to whatever had happened outside. Leaves dragged across the ground. Branches shifted above the tent. The fire collapsed softly as the wood burned through. I kept expecting footsteps to cross the campsite. I imagined someone stopping outside the fabric, close enough to hear us breathing. No one approached. Eventually, exhaustion took over. When I woke the following morning, sunlight was shining through the tent. The campsite looked harmless again. That is one of the strangest things about being afraid in the woods. Darkness can make every tree feel threatening, and then daylight arrives and makes you feel foolish for ever being frightened. We told our father what had happened. He listened but didn't seem concerned. In his opinion, we had heard an animal and allowed the stories to influence us. By then, I was beginning to agree. Nothing near the tents had been disturbed. No footprints or obvious signs showed that another person had passed through the site. We packed our equipment and loaded the car. By daylight, the screaming had already begun to feel less real. Then my youngest brother went into the bushes and came running back in tears. He had needed to use the bathroom before we left. There were no facilities nearby, so he walked away from the car for privacy. We heard him before we saw him. He was shouting for our father and repeating that someone was dead. At first, we assumed he was trying to frighten us after the previous night. Then he emerged from the trees. His face removed any doubt. He was crying and struggling to explain what he had found. My father told us to remain near the car, but we followed from a distance as my brother led him through the bushes. The farther we walked, the clearer it became that this wasn't a joke. Then we saw the woman. She was lying among the trees. I don't remember every detail clearly. I was young, terrified, and seeing a dead person for the first time. There was blood on and around her clothing. Dark bruises covered parts of her body. One shoe had come off, and a handgun lay near the other. She wasn't moving. My father immediately sent us back to the car and called the police. I don't remember how long we waited for the officers to arrive. Time felt strange after the discovery. The forest no longer resembled the place where we had camped. Every patch of trees seemed connected to the sounds from the night before. The officers questioned my father and eventually asked us what we had heard. We described the rustling near the campsite. We told them about the screams and explained that the second had sounded closer. Then we mentioned the thud. Because I was a child, the adults shared very little afterward. I never learned precisely when the woman died, who attacked her, or whether the gun belonged to her. One question became more disturbing as I grew older. Was the person responsible still nearby when my brother walked toward those moving bushes with a flashlight? At 11, I assumed the woman herself had caused the rustling. I imagined her running through the forest before collapsing somewhere near us. As an adult, I see another possibility. Something was moving close to the campsite. The movement stopped when my brother approached. Only then did the scream come from farther inside the trees. The thing in the bushes may not have been the woman. We left after the police allowed us to go. My father didn't take us camping again for a long time. For years, I thought the worst part was discovering the body. It wasn't. The part that still bothers me is how the sound traveled. The first scream was distant. The second came from closer to our fire. Then we heard something hit the ground. After that, the forest went silent. We had spent the evening telling one another stories that weren't real. Something real was happening outside the reach of the firelight. And while we hid in our tents, whoever caused it may have been close enough to see exactly where we were.